October 21st, 1964. Park Avenue, Manhattan. Joseph Bonanno walked out of his lawyer's office at 36 East 36th Street and into the cool autumn evening. He was 59 years old, impeccably dressed in a dark suit and fedora, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had never hurried for anyone. His driver waited at the curb, engine idling. Bonanno descended the steps, briefcase in hand, and paused on the sidewalk. Two men approached from opposite directions. They were not his men. What happened next would become one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of American organized crime. Joseph Bonanno, Joe Bananas, to those who mocked him, Don Pepino to those who respected him, vanished. He stepped into a car, or was forced into one, and disappeared from the streets of New York for 2 years. His absence would trigger a war that nearly destroyed one of the 5 families and exposed the American Mafia to unprecedented public scrutiny. But to understand why Joseph Bonanno disappeared, one must first understand what he was planning to do in the weeks before he vanished. He was plotting to murder the other bosses of New York's organized crime families and seize control of the Mafia's governing body, the Commission. It was an act of breathtaking ambition, supreme arrogance, and catastrophic miscalculation. Joseph Bonanno was born in 1905 in Castellammare del Golfo, a town on the northwestern coast of Sicily. It was a place that produced more American Mafia bosses per capita than perhaps anywhere else on Earth. The men of Castellammare were clannish, traditional, and violent. They brought those qualities with them when they immigrated to America in the early 20th century. Bonanno arrived in the United States in 1908 as a 3-year-old child. His family settled in Brooklyn, where young Joseph grew up speaking Sicilian at home and learning English in the streets. He was intelligent, educated, he briefly attended college, and ambitious. By his early 20s, he was already involved in bootlegging during Prohibition, working with other young Sicilian immigrants who would become the foundation of organized crime in New York. The 1930s were the formative years of the American Mafia as a structured organization. The Old World Mustache Petes, traditionalist Sicilian bosses who refused to work with non-Sicilians and clung to old feuds, were systematically murdered by younger, more pragmatic gangsters. The Castellammarese War of 1930-1931 was the final spasm of this generational conflict, ending with the assassination of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the 2 most powerful Old World bosses. From the ashes of that war emerged a new structure, the Commission. It was conceived as a governing body that would mediate disputes between the families, prevent wars, and coordinate criminal activities. The Commission initially consisted of the bosses of the 5 New York families, Luciano, Mangano, Galliano, Profaci, and Bonanno, plus representatives from other cities, particularly Chicago and Buffalo. Joseph Bonanno, at 26 years old, became the youngest boss ever to sit on the Commission. He inherited control of what would become known as the Bonanno family, a crime organization of several hundred maid members operating primarily in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Their rackets included gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and, despite official prohibitions, narcotics trafficking. For 3 decades, Bonanno ruled his family with an iron hand. He was old school in his methods and his worldview. He believed in omertà, the code of silence. He believed in the Sicilian traditions of honor and respect. He married Fay Labruzzo in 1931, and they had 3 sons. He presented himself as a legitimate businessman, operating cheese companies and funeral parlors, attending church, contributing to charities. But by the early 1960s, Joseph Bonanno's world was changing in ways he found intolerable. The other bosses were getting soft in his view. They were too willing to accommodate, too eager to avoid conflict, too comfortable with the status quo. Carlo Gambino, who had taken control of the family formerly run by Albert Anastasia after Anastasia's murder in 1957, was a diplomat, a consensus builder, a man who preferred negotiation to violence. Tommy Lucchese, boss of the family bearing his name, was similarly cautious, calculating, conservative. Bonanno despised them. He saw them as weak, as traitors to the old traditions, as men who had forgotten that power came from the barrel of a gun, not from boardrooms and backroom deals. And Bonanno had another grievance. The Commission had been interfering in his family's affairs. When his underboss, Carmine Galante, was sentenced to prison on narcotics charges in 1962, The commission had pressured Bonanno to replace him with Gaspar di Gregorio, a capo loyal to other families rather than to Bonanno. Bonanno had resisted, but the pressure continued. It was an insult, an intrusion, a challenge to his authority. So Joseph Bonanno decided to act. If the other bosses would not respect him, he would eliminate them and install leaders who would. The plot began to take shape in 1963. Bonanno confided in his son, Salvatore Bill Bonanno, who served as his consigliere. Together, they discussed the possibility of assassinating Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, the two most powerful bosses on the commission. With those two dead, Bonanno believed he could dominate the remaining families and restore what he saw as proper leadership to the American Mafia. But assassination plots require manpower, and manpower requires trust. Bonanno began sounding out loyalists within his own family, testing their willingness to participate in what would amount to a coup. He also reached out to Joe Magliocco, boss of the Profaci family, which would later become the Colombo family, who had his own grievances against Gambino and Lucchese. Magliocco was receptive. He too felt sidelined, disrespected. He agreed to participate in the plot and assigned one of his most capable soldiers, Joe Colombo, to carry out the actual hits. It was a catastrophic mistake. Joe Colombo, despite his reputation as a loyal soldier, recognized immediately that the plot was doomed. Assassinating two commission bosses would trigger a war that could not be won. The other families would unite against Bonanno and Magliocco. Blood would flow in the streets. Federal law enforcement, already increasing its attention on organized crime after the 1957 Appalachian meeting exposed the Mafia's existence to the public, would descend with full force. Colombo made a choice. He went to Carlo Gambino and revealed the plot. Gambino, the consummate strategist, did not panic. He convened an emergency meeting of the commission, without Bonanno or Magliocco. The bosses discussed the situation and reached a decision. Joe Magliocco would be summoned to explain himself. If he cooperated and named Bonanno as the instigator, he might be allowed to retire peacefully. Joseph Bonanno, however, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He would be killed. Magliocco was called before the commission in the fall of 1963. Faced with the choice between death and cooperation, he chose cooperation. He confirmed that Bonanno had been the architect of the plot. He agreed to step down as boss of the Profaci family and retire. In exchange, his life was spared. He died of natural causes, a heart attack just a few months later, in December 1963, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to the grave. Joseph Bonanno, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware that his plot had been exposed. He continued his daily routine, attending to family business, meeting with associates, planning for a future in which he would rule the commission. Then, in early 1964, he began to sense that something was wrong. Associates were nervous, meetings were canceled, phone calls went unreturned. Bonanno was not a fool. He had survived in the Mafia for 40 years by reading signals, by recognizing when the temperature changed. By the summer of 1964, Bonanno knew he was in danger. The commission summoned him to a meeting, a command appearance where he would be expected to answer questions about the assassination plot. Bonanno understood what such meetings often meant. Men who attended were sometimes carried out. He did not attend. He ignored the summons, claiming illness, offering excuses, buying time. The commission grew impatient. They issued orders. Joseph Bonanno was to be brought before them, by force if necessary. If he continued to refuse, he would be killed. And so on the evening of October 21, 1964, two men approached Joseph Bonanno on Park Avenue. What happened next depends on who tells the story. According to some accounts, Joseph Bonanno was kidnapped by members of rival families acting on commission orders. He was forced into a car at gunpoint, driven to a safe house and held prisoner while the commission decided his fate. According to other accounts, including Bonanno's own later claims, he voluntarily went into hiding, recognizing that his life was in danger and calculating that his absence would buy him time to negotiate, to plan, to survive. The truth, as with so much in the history of the Mafia, remains elusive. What is certain is that Joseph Bonanno disappeared on October 21, 1964, and did not resurface publicly until May 1966, 19 months later. His disappearance triggered immediate chaos within his family. Without a boss, without clear leadership, the Bonanno organization fractured. Some members remained loyal to Bonanno and his son Bill, who attempted to assume control in his father's absence. Others, fearing the commission's wrath or seeing an opportunity for advancement, aligned with Gaspar Di Gregorio, the capo whom the commission had tried to install as underboss. The commission, eager to stabilize the situation and prevent a power vacuum, officially recognized Di Gregorio as the new boss of the Bonanno family. Di Gregorio, a veteran mobster in his 60s, accepted the position and began consolidating control, demanding that Bonanno loyalists pledge their allegiance or face consequences. Bill Bonanno refused. He considered Di Gregorio a usurper, a puppet of Gambino and the other commission bosses. He rallied loyalists and prepared to fight. The stage was set for war. The Bonanno War, a nickname coined by the press playing on Bonanno's surname, began not with a single dramatic event, but with a series of escalating confrontations in late 1964 and early 1965. Shootings, beatings, bombings. The violence was sporadic at first, almost tentative, as if both sides were testing each other's resolve. But by the summer of 1965, the conflict intensified. Members of the Bonanno family were being killed in the streets. Bodies turned up in car trunks, in vacant lots, in the rivers around New York. The violence was unusually public, drawing media attention and alarming city officials. January 28, 1966, Troutman Street, Brooklyn. Bill Bonanno and several loyalists were ambushed outside a building on Troutman Street. Di Gregorio's gunmen opened fire with shotguns and pistols, the shots echoing through the residential neighborhood. Somehow, miraculously, no one was killed. Bill Bonanno and his men escaped, but the ambush, brazen, loud, witnessed by civilians, made headlines. Mob war erupts in Brooklyn, the Daily News declared. The New York Times ran stories detailing the factionalism within the Bonanno family, naming names, describing the structure of the organization. The Mafia, which prided itself on secrecy and discretion, was being exposed in excruciating detail. The FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, seized the opportunity. Hoover had long denied the existence of a national organized crime network, dismissing it as exaggerated or fictional. But the 1957 Appalachian meeting, where police stumbled upon a gathering of mafia bosses from across the country, had forced Hoover to acknowledge reality. By the mid-1960s, the FBI was dedicating significant resources to investigating organized crime, and the Bonanno War provided a wealth of intelligence. Agents surveilled both factions, documenting meetings, photographing participants, recording license plates. They cultivated informants within the family, offering deals to low-level members caught in the crossfire, pressuring them to provide information in exchange for leniency. The other commission bosses watched the Bonanno War with dismay. The violence was bad for business. It attracted attention from law enforcement, from politicians, from the media. It violated the very purpose of the commission, to prevent wars and maintain order. Carlo Gambino and the other bosses decided that the war had to end. They brokered a truce in 1966, forcing both Di Gregorio and Bill Bonanno to stand down. Di Gregorio was quietly removed as boss, his tenure having accomplished little beyond prolonging the conflict. A new boss, Paul Sciacca, was installed as a compromise candidate, someone neither faction could object to too strenuously. But the damage was done. The Bonanno family, once one of the most powerful and cohesive of the five families, was fractured, weakened, its reputation in tatters. And Joseph Bonanno, the man whose ambition had triggered the disaster, remained missing. Where was he? Theories abounded. Some law enforcement officials believed he was dead, murdered by the commission and buried in a location that would never be found. Others believed he was hiding, perhaps in Sicily, protected by old allies waiting for an opportunity to return. The truth was stranger than either theory. Joseph Bonanno spent most of his 19-month disappearance in Haiti. He had fled there with the assistance of loyalists who arranged his transportation and secured his accommodations. Haiti in the mid-1960s was ruled by François Papadoc Duvalier, a dictator who controlled the country through brutality, corruption, and a network of secret police known as the Tonton Macoute. Duvalier's regime was happy to host wealthy fugitives in exchange for bribes, and Bonanno had money. Bonanno lived quietly, avoiding public appearances, communicating with his son Bill through intermediaries. He read newspapers, followed the war tearing apart his family, and calculated his next move. By early 1966, it became clear that he could not remain in exile indefinitely. His family was disintegrating, his son was under siege, and the Commission, while still hostile, might be willing to negotiate rather than prolong a conflict that was damaging everyone. Bonanno began reaching out through intermediaries, floating the possibility of his return. The Commission, eager to end the Bonanno War and restore some semblance of order, agreed to negotiate. The terms were non-negotiable. Bonanno would return, he would retire from active leadership of his family, and he would relocate far from New York. In exchange, his life would be spared. Bonanno accepted. On May 17, 1966, Joseph Bonanno appeared at the federal courthouse in Manhattan, escorted by his lawyer. He claimed he had been kidnapped in October 1964 and held captive against his will, until his captors released him just days earlier. He offered no details about where he had been held or who had held him. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when pressed by federal prosecutors. No one believed his story. But it didn't matter. He was back. He was alive. And the war, for the moment, was over. Joseph Bonanno relocated to Tucson, Arizona in 1968, fulfilling his agreement with the Commission to leave New York permanently. Tucson was a world away from Brooklyn. Dry desert air instead of humid streets, sprawling ranch houses instead of crowded tenements, a pace of life that moved slowly, deliberately, without urgency. Bonanno purchased a home in a quiet neighborhood, presented himself as a retired businessman, and attempted to live the life the Commission had demanded: obscurity, inactivity, irrelevance. But Joseph Bonanno was incapable of irrelevance. He maintained contacts with his former organization. He advised his son Bill on family matters. He traveled occasionally, ostensibly for business, but law enforcement believed the trips were related to ongoing criminal activity, and he began to write. In 1983, Bonanno published his memoir, A Man of Honor, a 480-page book that presented his version of events, his rise to power, his conflicts with the Commission, his disappearance and return. It was a remarkable document, part self-justification, part historical record, part mythology. The book enraged the other bosses. Mafia members did not write memoirs. They did not speak publicly about the organization. They certainly did not publish books naming names, describing operations, and airing grievances. Bonanno defended the memoir as his right to tell his own story. But to the Commission, it was a final insult from a man who had already insulted them enough. There were rumors that Bonanno had been marked for death after the book's publication, but no attempt on his life materialized. He was old by then, in his late 70s, living quietly in Arizona, no longer a threat to anyone's power. Perhaps the other bosses decided that killing him would only draw more attention, make him a martyr, give credibility to his memoir. Or perhaps they simply didn't care anymore. Meanwhile, the Bonanno family in New York continued its decline. The leadership installed after the Bonanno War struggled to maintain control. Internal factionalism persisted, and the family, weakened and distrusted by the other families, became a target for law enforcement. The FBI had intensified its efforts against the Mafia in the 1970s, using wiretaps, informants, and undercover agents to penetrate the organizations. The Bonanno family, with its fractured structure and diminished cohesion, was particularly vulnerable. In 1976, an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone, using the alias Donnie Brasco, infiltrated the Bonanno family. Posing as a jewel thief and fence, Pistone befriended Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, a soldier in the family, and gradually worked his way deeper into the organization. Over 6 years, Pistone gathered intelligence on criminal operations, identified key members, and documented activities that would later form the basis for dozens of federal prosecutions. The Donnie Brasco operation was one of the most successful undercover infiltrations in FBI history, and it devastated the Bonanno family. When Pistone's true identity was revealed in 1981, the family's leadership was humiliated. Lefty Ruggiero, the soldier who had vouched for Pistone, was marked for death, not because he was a traitor, but because he had been fooled, and his mistake had brought disaster upon the family. Ruggiero was arrested before the family could kill him and spent the rest of his life in prison dying of cancer in 1994. The Bonanno family never fully recovered. It remained one of the five families in name, but its power, prestige, and influence were shadows of what they had been before Joseph Bonanno's disastrous attempt to seize control of the commission. Joseph Bonanno lived to the age of 97, dying on May 11, 2002 in Tucson. He had outlived his enemies, his allies, and most of his contemporaries. He had survived assassination attempts, federal prosecution, and exile. He had written his memoir, told his story, and refused to the end to express regret for the choices he had made. His funeral was a small private affair. A few family members, a few old friends, a few curious onlookers. No mob bosses attended. No representatives from the five families sent condolences. The American Mafia had moved on, and Joseph Bonanno was a relic, a footnote, a cautionary tale. The Bonanno War represents a turning point in the history of American organized crime. It exposed the fragility of the Commission's authority, demonstrated that even bosses were not immune to hubris and miscalculation, and proved that internal conflicts could be as destructive as external threats. The war also marked the beginning of the end for the traditional mafia's dominance in American organized crime. The violence drew law enforcement scrutiny that would intensify over the following decades. The RICO statute, passed in 1970, gave federal prosecutors powerful tools to dismantle entire criminal organizations by charging bosses with conspiracy and racketeering. The FBI's infiltration of the Bonanno family via Donnie Brasco demonstrated that the mafia's vaunted code of omertà could be breached. By the 1980s and 1990s, the five families were under siege. The commission itself was prosecuted in the famous Commission Trial of 1985-1986, which resulted in the convictions of the bosses of the Lucchese, Colombo, and Genovese families, along with underbosses and capos from other families. The trial, which specifically invoked RICO to charge the defendants with running a criminal enterprise, effectively decapitated the mafia's leadership structure. The Bonanno family, having been weakened by the Bonanno War and further damaged by the Donnie Brasco infiltration, was already diminished by the time the broader crackdown began. It survived into the 21st century, but as a shell of its former self, with a fraction of its previous membership and influence. Joseph Bonanno's attempt to assassinate Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese in 1963-1964 seems, in retrospect, staggeringly foolish. He was a powerful boss, respected in his own family, secure in his position. He could have lived comfortably, managed his criminal enterprises, and died peacefully in his sleep. Instead, his ambition and his contempt for the other bosses led him to plot a coup that was doomed from the start. The plot failed because Joe Colombo, the man assigned to carry out the assassinations, recognized it as suicidal and betrayed Bonanno to Carlo Gambino. But even if Colombo had remained loyal, the plot would likely have failed. Assassinating two commission bosses would have required perfect execution, absolute secrecy, and immediate consolidation of power. Any delay, any mistake, any leak would trigger a war that Bonanno could not win. Bonanno's greatest miscalculation was underestimating Carlo Gambino. Gambino was everything Bonanno was not: patient, pragmatic, willing to build consensus and alliances rather than rule through intimidation. Gambino understood that power in the modern mafia came not from being the strongest, but from being indispensable, from being the man other bosses turned to for advice, mediation, and leadership. When Gambino learned of Bonanno's plot, he did not respond with immediate violence. He convened the commission, built a consensus, isolated Bonanno politically before moving against him physically. It was a masterclass in strategic thinking, and it ensured that when Bonanno disappeared in October 1964, the other families would support Gambino's actions rather than question them. Bonanno's 19-month disappearance remains one of the great mysteries of mafia history. His own account, that he was kidnapped and held captive, was almost certainly a fabrication, a story designed to save face and avoid admitting that he had fled in fear. But the details of where he was, who helped him, and how he negotiated his return have never been fully confirmed. What is clear is that the disappearance triggered a war that Bonanno had not intended and could not control. The Bonanno War was fought primarily between factions within his own family, with Bonanno loyalists battling commission-backed rivals for control. It was a civil war, brutal and chaotic, that accomplished nothing except to weaken the family and expose it to law enforcement. The war also had unintended consequences for the broader mafia. The public violence, the newspaper headlines, the FBI surveillance, All of it contributed to a growing awareness among law enforcement and policymakers that organized crime was a serious, national problem that required federal intervention. The RICO statute passed in 1970 was a direct response to this awareness, and it would become the primary legal tool used to dismantle the mafia over the following decades. Joseph Bonanno's memoir, A Man of Honor, published in 1983, was another unintended legacy. The book was widely read, not just by true crime enthusiasts, but by law enforcement, prosecutors, and journalists seeking to understand the inner workings of the mafia. Bonanno intended the book as a defense of his actions and a critique of the other bosses who had, in his view, betrayed mafia traditions. Instead, it became a sourcebook for federal investigators building cases against the organization. The book also violated one of the mafia's most sacred rules: silence. Mafia members did not speak publicly about the organization, its structure, or its activities. Bonanno's willingness to write a memoir, to name names and describe operations, was seen by other bosses as a betrayal comparable to becoming an informant. That Bonanno was never killed for this betrayal is testament to his irrelevance by the 1980s. He was an old man, living in Arizona, no longer a threat, no longer important enough to warrant assassination. The Bonanno family's decline continued after Joseph Bonanno's death in 2002. A series of bosses came and went, most serving short tenures before being arrested or forced out. The family's membership dwindled to perhaps a few dozen made members, down from several hundred in its heyday. Its criminal operations shrank to small-scale gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. A far cry from the empire Joseph Bonanno had ruled in the 1940s and 1950s. In 2004, Joseph Massino, who had become boss of the Bonanno family in the 1990s, became the first sitting boss in mafia history to become a government informant. Facing life in prison on murder and racketeering charges, Massino agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors, testifying against other mobsters and providing information about the family's operations. It was a stunning betrayal, unthinkable in earlier eras, and it symbolized the complete collapse of the Omerta Code that had once defined the mafia. The Bonanno family, already weakened by the Bonanno War and the Donnie Brasco infiltration, was effectively finished. It limped along into the 2010s and 2020s, recognized as one of the 5 families, but functioning more as a historical artifact than an active criminal organization. The Bonanno War, like all mafia conflicts, had a human cost that extended beyond the gangsters who chose to participate. Innocent people, family members, bystanders, business owners caught in the crossfire, suffered because of the violence Joseph Bonanno's ambition unleashed. During the war, at least a dozen men were killed in shootings, bombings, and beatings. Some were soldiers, men who knew the risks and accepted them. Others were marginal figures, associates or hangers-on who happened to be in the wrong place. Their deaths were rarely investigated thoroughly. Witnesses refused to cooperate. Evidence disappeared. Cases went cold. The families of these men, wives, children, parents, were left to grieve without answers. Mafia culture demanded silence, so they could not speak openly about what had happened or seek justice through legal channels. They buried their dead and moved on, carrying the weight of grief and the stigma of association with organized crime. The broader Italian-American community also suffered. The Bonanno War, with its sensational headlines and lurid details, reinforced stereotypes about Italian-Americans and criminality. The vast majority of Italian-Americans had no connection to the mafia, but the actions of men like Joseph Bonanno tarred the entire community with the same brush. Business owners in Italian neighborhoods found themselves under increased scrutiny from law enforcement, their legitimate enterprises suspected of being mafia fronts. Young Italian-American men were profiled, assumed to have mob connections simply because of their surnames. The community worked for decades to overcome these stereotypes, but the damage was real and lasting. The violence of the Bonanno War also had psychological effects on the participants. Soldiers on both sides lived in constant fear of assassination. They varied their routines, avoided public places, trusted no one. Some developed stress-related illnesses, ulcers, high blood pressure, heart problems. Others turned to alcohol or drugs to cope. Bill Bonanno, Joseph's son, spent years fighting the war his father had started. He survived multiple assassination attempts, spent time in prison on contempt charges for refusing to testify before grand juries, and watched his father's legacy disintegrate. In later years, he too wrote a memoir, Bound by Honor, which offered his perspective on the conflict. He died in 2008, 6 years after his father, having spent much of his life trying to escape the shadow of the Banana War. Gaspar di Gregorio, the commission-backed rival boss, fared little better. He was removed from leadership in 1966, deemed ineffective and incapable of ending the conflict. He lived in obscurity until his death in 1970, his brief tenure as boss remembered as a failure. The war's biggest winner, ironically, was Carlo Gambino. He emerged from the conflict with his power enhanced, his reputation as a skilled strategist cemented. He continued to lead his family until his death from natural causes in 1976, one of the few mafia bosses to die peacefully of old age. His success in outmaneuvering Joseph Bonanno became a case study in strategic thinking, demonstrating that in the mafia, as in any organization, intelligence and patience often triumph over brute force. Joseph Bonanno lived 97 years, far longer than most mafia bosses. He outlived his enemies, his allies, and the era in which he had thrived. By the time he died in 2002, the world he had known, the world of omerta and commission meetings, of territorial disputes and codes of honor, had largely disappeared. The modern mafia, to the extent it still existed, was a diminished thing, prosecuted relentlessly by federal authorities armed with RICO statutes and surveillance technology, infiltrated by undercover agents and informants, exposed by cooperating witnesses willing to testify in exchange for lighter sentences. Bonanno's legacy is complex. He was a skilled organizer who built a powerful criminal organization and ruled it for decades. He was a traditionalist who believed in the old Sicilian ways and resented the Americanization of the mafia. He was an ambitious man who overreached, who plotted a coup that destroyed his family and triggered a war that accomplished nothing. He was also a survivor. He lived through the Castellamarese War, the formation of the Commission, the Appalachian Meeting, his own disappearance and exile, and the federal crackdown that dismantled the mafia. He published a memoir, told his story, and died peacefully in his bed, a fate few mafia bosses achieved. But survival is not the same as success. Joseph Bonanno's attempt to seize control of the Commission in 1963-1964 was a catastrophic failure that weakened his family, empowered his enemies, and contributed to the broader collapse of the American Mafia. The Banana War, which resulted from his miscalculation, was a humiliating spectacle that exposed the Mafia's inner workings and invited law enforcement scrutiny. In the end, Joseph Bonanno's greatest achievement may have been his longevity. He lived long enough to see the consequences of his actions, to watch his family disintegrate, to recognize that the world he had tried to control had moved on without him. He was a relic, a reminder of an era that had passed. And when he died in 2002, the Mafia, the organization to which he had dedicated his life, barely noticed. The Banana War was over. It had been over for decades, but its effects, the weakened Bonanno family, the emboldened federal prosecutors, the shattered myth of mafia invincibility, endured. Joseph Bonanno had wanted to be remembered as a man of honor, a leader who upheld tradition and commanded respect. Instead, he is remembered as the man who started a war that destroyed his family, disappeared for 2 years to save his own life, and lived long enough to see everything he built crumble into dust. It is not the legacy he intended, but it is the legacy he earned.
If you made it to the end, thank you. Please leave a like and subscribe. It helps me create more stories like this one, because some secrets are still waiting to be heard.